the Nikon Z8. So I've had this amazing camera for a little over 2 months now, and I've taken it to some rough and amazing places here in Alaska. The Kenai Peninsula, Chugach Mountains, and most recently, 3 weeks on Kodiak Island. A lot of rain, sand, rocks, and muck. So how did it hold up, and what do I think of this new offering from Nikon as a bird and wildlife camera? Well, let's talk about it. I did make an initial review of this camera in the first couple of weeks after I picked it up at Stewart's Photo here in Anchorage. Mainly as on paper and pre-production reviews I've seen. It had a lot of the same specs and abilities as the Nikon Z9, which I've been shooting for a little over 9 months and have a good feel of what those abilities are. So what I wanted to do is to give this a good test in the field before I talked about it. And I also knew that I had this Kodiak trip coming up and knew that would be a good test of the camera for the tough shooting environments and conditions. And what's the general consensus over the last couple months with this camera? Well, it's a fantastic camera and probably the best in its price point. We'll be talking more about that in a video I'm working on currently. I'm making these comparisons of the Canon, Sony, and the Nikon camera that are all in that $4,000 price range. So you'll have to wait until then to see which camera body and why that camera body makes it to the top of the list. I'm sure that's going to bring a lot of fun comments from the fans of each camera brand. But back to the Z8 and what I've learned and how I feel about this camera after using it over the last few months, shooting a lot of birds, bears, moose, fox, whales, and whatever else came across my path here in Alaska. Well, let's run down the specs real fast of the camera for those that aren't familiar with the Z9, and then we'll go through the pros and cons of the camera and my final verdict on what type of wildlife photographer this camera is for. So this is a 45.7 megapixel full-frame mirrorless camera. Backside illuminated stacked CMOS sensor with a sensor readout speed of about 3.7 milliseconds. Full electronic shutter. There's no mechanical shutter in this camera. Shoots 20 frames per second in full uncompressed RAW and up to 120 frames per second in JPEG. The shutter speeds are reached up to 1/32,000th of a second. Has a 1 second pre-capture capability. Has a base ISO of 64 up to 256,000. Dual card slots, one CF Express and one UHS 2 SD. In-body stabilization of 5 stops, 3.7 million EVF, and a body weighing in about 2 pounds with the battery. So let's talk about the pros of the Nikon Z8. So first, the feel. It feels really great in the hand. It has plenty of room for all my fingers. It's comfortable enough in the hand when holding my large and heavy lenses. It's a comfortable weight at 2 pounds with the battery. It makes it a good balance for handheld and easy to balance on a gimbal and a monopod when you put it on it. So the button layout. The button layout is pretty close to the Nikon Z9, so if you have one of those, the layout's can be really easy to move between the cameras. It's only missing one button on the front, the function buttons on the front. And it gives you 2 instead of 3, not a big deal there. The on-off switch is much easier to move than the Nikon Z9, which makes it very comfortable without a amount of resistance when you turn it on and off. The mode dial is different on the side. On the Nikon Z9 it stands up real high. This one's more flush, so you're going to be using that mode dial over here on your window most of the time. And I'm losing a leg here on this little mount here, so got that back open. But yeah, your mode dials differently. On the Nikon Z9, as I say, it is, you have a little tab you push and you turn it. On this one, you just hit the mode and then look over here on the top right of your camera or on your back LCD screen to see what you're changing as far as frame rates and modes and things like white balance, things like that. And I think I actually like this setup better because somehow on the Nikon Z9, you actually have to push this little button down, a physical button down, and then turn the dial. Somehow, even on that, I managed to change it from 20 frames a second down to 10 frames a second from plus to normal, and I didn't notice what it was until I hit the shutter and I heard the frame rate sounding slower and then realized what I'd done. On this one, I'm not going to have that problem. You got to hit it and do a couple of things over here, but there's a possibility you could, but kind of like this a little bit better than the Z9 as far as the mode dial button goes. The card door opens a lot easier, which I really kind of like because it really just pops right open. It doesn't have a lock switch like on the Nikon Z9. The Nikon Z9 sometimes is really hard to get that door open at times, but this one's a lot easier to open, so that's really cool. All right, EVF on this guy. EVF on this guy is fantastic. 3.7 million dots, which is less than some of the other flagship cameras out there or even some of the middle line cameras. But that's more than enough. The thing you want in your EVF is brightness, a good refresh speed, and clarity in there. So those three things meet on this viewfinder. Everything's clear. 120 megahertz refresh makes everything really smooth when you're panning across. And the resolution and the brightness, you can really brighten this up to past the 5 or 10. What it goes to 5 or 10 on here. It goes to 11, doesn't it? But it got 2 extra levels, so you can really get this thing really bright. So when you have those bright days, you can really still see through your viewfinder quite well. And it also has 0 blackout when you're shooting stills, which is just fantastic. So on to the LCD. The color and resolution on this thing is really good. The articulating screen on the back of it is fantastic. You can get your low shots, you can get it in this mode. If you need high shots, you can move it around. You can really move it out in a lot of different things. If you need to go into portrait mode, real good. Really, really nice. I like the LCD screen. I was worried about with the Z9, would I break these mounts in here, this metal here? No, and I'm pretty rough on equipment, so this thing is held up really, really well in that regard. So on to the shutter and the sensor on this camera. This camera is full electronic, no mechanical shutter on this thing. And that's kind of where I think all these higher end cameras are going to end up going at one point, is getting rid of the mechanical shutter. Once these electronic or global shutters get better and better, that's going to be nice, especially with these stacked sensors. You're fast, 3.7 milliseconds. That is incredibly fast on the sensor readout speed. And with that, we're talking about it has no rolling shutter with that 3.7 milliseconds. And it's a 45.7 megapixel backside illuminated stacked CMOS sensor. Like I said, 3.7 milliseconds, which is the fastest right now I know of on the market as far as the readout speed on a sensor. Like I said before, it'll shoot up at 32 thousandths of a second on the shutter speed. Extremely fast. Those hummingbirds aren't going to stand a chance. It shoots 20 frames per second, uncompressed, raw, and 120 in JPEG. And that is incredible. 30 probably would be better, but 20 is really good. I noticed with some of the other cameras shooting 40 frames a second, that's too much. So I think 20 to 30 is really that sweet spot. And at 20 frames a second with this guy, it's fantastic. Because that means the buffer on this guy with a really fast Type B card, you're going to get about 100 some frames before you hit the buffer wall on this thing. And then after that, which is fantastic, it doesn't stop. It just keeps going. After that, it'll keep shooting 16 frames. So you go 20 frames, 100 so shots, then you're at 16 frames a second. And why is that good? People say spray and pray. Well, not really. If you have a swan that's taken off, it takes him a long way for a swan to get off the lake or a river or wherever he's on. And you're going to need more than 4 or 5 seconds to get that shot. There's other examples too where you're trying to get that exact moment and you don't know when it's going to happen. Maybe it's a bird singing on top, and a lot of people like to get those water vapor brush shots of birds. Well, you're going to need to be able to hit that longer to time it just right, because sometimes it may be a tweet or a quick tweet. You want to get that mouth position just right, so you're going to need to hold that down a lot longer on that buffer. So that's what's really nice about it. It does have a silent shutter mode on this. You can turn the sound completely off, or you can move to various levels on that. The Z9 got the 4.0 upgrade firmware to it, and it gave you new camera sounds, which I really like. I hope they bring that to this pretty soon with Z8. And I'm expecting to see some of those Z9 updates, I hope, on the Z8, like the auto capture. That may stay Z9, but it doesn't make much sense, that expensive camera only having that auto capture. But hopefully that'll trickle down to the Z8, along with some of the other features that the Z8 got, or Z9, excuse me, got in that 4.0 patch. Image quality on this camera is fantastic. The sensor on this camera really gets the colors and the contrast that I really like out of an image. And the biggest testament to this camera and the Z9 to me is I get more images right in camera than I do on all my other cameras on here, because the colors and the way this camera, this sensor exposes to get those colors is just more what I like for what I do in the field. It's really, really nice. All right, autofocus. This is the one a lot of people have opinions on. And you have to remember, I've always been a Canon shooter, and I've had a lot of time now on the Nikon cameras. And I use both systems daily and know what they're both capable of. I'm not going to get into this video who is better, which manufacturer, but wanted that out there so we don't have a lot of Canon or Nikon fans pinging me and saying that this is better or that's better. Mainly, can you get focus? Can you hold the focus? And in what conditions to get the shot? The autofocus has subject detect of people, animals, vehicles, airplanes, or autofocus detection of all, which means basically it will look at the scene and say, oh, I see an airplane or I see an animal, and it will shift to that type of subject detect and focus on it. And depending on the subject and the environment and using it in the right autofocus mode, that's the key one of this camera, the autofocus on this camera is really good. For birds in flight, it's great. For birds against a non-busy background, using the auto area detect works the best for me. And on busier backgrounds, the wide L, the smaller box, works the best for me in those examples. Example of this wide L working the best for semi-busy backgrounds is when we had the kingfishers in Kodiak. You saw that video we had a few weeks ago. The birds were flying really low across the water against a semi-busy background. And the autofocus using the wide L hit almost every time. The reason why the wide L worked best was the focus uses a small box that initially works kind of like the old DSLRs, where it goes to the focus plane. When it sees something, it locks that plane. And then as it goes along, it will eventually lock up the bird and then hit the bird, and you can switch if you want to 3D autofocus, or just keep that box on them, which I just left the box on them. It was actually hitting faster than the R7, not the bird detect part of it, but the general focus in general. The R7 will grab the eye faster, but not the bird itself in this scenario. So this is an example of what I mean when I say sometimes Canon grabs faster and sometimes Nikon grabs faster, at least the focal plane and getting the bird in focus. And these cameras, the Canon and the Nikon, are just completely different beasts. And we'll get into that in another video, talking about the autofocus systems of the Nikon, the Canon, and the Sony in that $4,000 range cameras. We'll get into that in another video. All right, what about weather sealing? Well, from what I can tell, when I've used it and when I've read a lot, the weather sealing on this guy is great. I did have this camera out in the rain quite a bit on the Kodiak trip because the entire 3 weeks, all it did was rain the entire time. Another video coming soon about that. Okay, moving on to video. Wow, I've been blown away by the video on this guy. Being able to shoot in 4K 120 frames a second has been very nice, because previously I only been able to shoot 1080p in 120 frames a second. And out of the box colors on this guy are fantastic. I couldn't be happier with the video. And the autofocus in the video grabs the eye, works on it. I very seldom do I have it pulse and go to something else unless I've got a bird that really blends, or a pike that really blends into the rocks, whatever it is, and it turns his body completely away from me. It may lose it there, but all the other cameras do too. All right, let's move over to the cons of the Nikon Z8. And yes, every camera is not perfect. All right, so the feel, the negatives of the feel. The body, even though it's one of the larger without a battery grip, is still a little bit small for using with your large prime lenses. The body still digs in to my hand here in the middle, because when I hold it, it's still here in the middle of my hand. I don't know if you can really see that, but it does get uncomfortable holding it for a long period of time. So if this was my only body, I'd have bought the grip for this thing. And I'm not a fan of it where I tested on a lot of my friends' cameras, the grip that is. It makes the camera actually taller and bigger than the Z9. On top of that, if you add the grip and the extra battery, you're only saving about $1,000 versus the Z9 versus the R8. And at that point, I just suggest you get the Z9 if this is your only camera and you want to get the grip because of the size. And the Z9 has a few more features with the 4.0 firmware release, like I said, like the auto capture and a little bit of the focus and sounds and things like that. Now, the next negative is the dual SD card slots. It has one CF Express and one Type 2 SD card slot. And if you're only shooting one card like me, the CF Express Type B, or using rollover, it's not really a negative. But if you shoot redundant, which is both cards at once with the same image, then you're slowed down to the SD card speed, and you only get about 40 shots in before you hit that buffer at uncompressed RAW, and then you're like 5-6 frames a second. So be aware of that. All right, the next negative on this camera to me is actually the SD card door. Remember earlier I said I liked it because it opened real easy, just like that. But since it opens so easily, there was several times where I was in Kodiak Island and I would lift the camera up to my eye and notice the battery door was open just like that. It got knocked open somewhere where I'm pulling it out or walking with it. And it happened a lot more than I'd liked it to while I was out there. And several times I was in the rain, the muck, and the sand when it happened. Luckily, nothing got inside this door, and I got it shut before anything happened, but it was very unnerving nonetheless. So this battery door being able to get bumped just that easily, just, you know, here at the back of my hand, just, you know, like that, it's a little bit unnerving. So maybe I do like the lock on the Z9 more, but I do hate fighting that Z9 door to get it open a lot of times. I just wish they had something different on here with some type of other catch mechanism that wouldn't open so easily. And maybe it's just my version of the camera. Maybe my door opens a lot easier than everybody else's, but I bumped it tons of times in the field, and it was very, very unnerving to see that and be scared that sand or something would get inside that door, or rain or mud or something. So, all right, on to the next negative of this camera, and it is the battery on this guy. It uses the EN-EL15C battery. And this is a smaller battery, and it's an older battery from what I understand too. And it's rated at 2280 milliamp hours. And even with swapping this guy out to a second battery, it still, to me, didn't make it through a full day of shooting. I mean, a hard day's use. If I was doing, you know, kind of an average day's use, you know, or smaller than average day use, it kind of 2 batteries would make it through the day. And this battery actually rates higher than the R5 battery, because R5 battery is like 2130 milliamp hours. This is 2280. It should, you know, 150 more milliamp hours. But the R5 will make it through entire day on those, and I'll still have a lot of battery left on that second battery. But I think what it is, the Z9 and the Z8 really, this thing draws a lot of power, and I think that's why that's draining faster. But I wish they'd have put a new battery or bigger battery in this guy. But again, just have 3 batteries on you, and I think you'll be good on this camera for one of your harder day shots, like say maybe you're out on safari or out in the field doing some work. This should be fine if you have 3 batteries, but don't just skimp with just 2. It's not major, but something you should be aware of, you know, in the field when you're going out. All right, autofocus concerns or negative. And yes, it's not perfect, and neither is Sony or Canon cameras on the autofocus. But again, the more time you put on the camera, the better you're going to get with the camera's use in its autofocus. If the bird is close to the background, or a low contrast situation in the background, or extremely out of focus between you and where it is when you're panning towards the bird, the autofocus is going to jump out to infinity or to the background. It just will. Now, Sony is pretty bad about that too, and Canon can be at times also. So don't get that wrong that this camera is bad. I mean, all the mirrorless cameras will jump to background and stick there. But using the right autofocus mode, which is key on this camera, getting exposure contrast to the subject better for the autofocus mode, and that works on all 3 of these manufacturers. And being aware that if your autofocus is starting too far away from your subject or too close to your subject, by moving it real quickly in manual mode, or having a button that jumps to a certain distance from you where the bird won't be as blurry, you're going to get good results. And that's true on all 3 of these brands. But with the Nikon, you got to have that right autofocus mode set up. That's the key part on this. So more time behind the camera lens on this camera is going to help you get that autofocus better. But if you're in a panic, try to grab the bird under a lot of these bad quote situations I just talked about, you're going to miss autofocus. And it's a little bit frustrating at times. And it seems to be a little more frustrating with the Nikon Z9 versus the Canon. And the Sony, we'll talk about that later, how it aggravates me or keeps me happy. But as far as we've seen, just like with the Z9, with the firmware patches keep coming and coming and coming, the autofocus on that Z9 got drastically better. And the same thing comes to this. Right now, out of the box, this thing's the same as the Z9 as far as the autofocus capabilities. Now, the LCD negative. You know, a lot of these things I said they're positives. I'm talking about the positives and the negative of them. The one thing with the LCD, and really it's not a negative to me as much, is that it will not flip around here to the front where you could look at the front of the camera and see the LCD screen here. And the biggest thing about this is I really don't see that much of an issue, because this is a wildlife shooter's camera. It's not a creator's camera where you're going to be filming yourself and you want to see stuff there, or having it on a tripod filming yourself. And if you do, just get an external recorder or monitor put on here and you're good to go. And it works really good on there. So that's one positive I forgot to say about this camera and all Nikon cameras. If you hook up an external monitor, like the Atomos here, if you got it on here and you hook it up, you can still see through your LCD here, excuse me, and the EVF here, and also see through your monitor. But with Canon and Sony, once you hook this guy up, you can't see through your LCD or your monitor anymore. You can only see through that monitor, which really bites, because if you're trying to give birds in flight, like I want to give you examples of birds in flight with the Canon R5, the R7, all those cameras, it's extremely hard for me because I would have to be doing this to try to track them, to look through this monitor on top. But with the Nikon, I can hold it to my eye, get the shots, the recorder records it. So you'll probably get more bird in flight videos out of this camera than you would out of the Canon cameras or the Sony cameras. Okay, that's my review of this camera. I've really ran it through the ringer in some tough conditions, some tricky subjects to photograph, and it's a fantastic camera. And who is this camera for? Well, if you like the Z9 but you feel like it's too heavy for you, then grab this guy. It's 30% lighter than the Z9. It's much easier on the body for hikes and that kind of stuff. If you're a hybrid video and stills person, this camera is fantastic for you. It shoots both just like the Z9, and again, it's lighter. This is a bird and wildlife shooter's camera. Stack sensor, fastest readout speed on the market, 20 frames uncompressed raw, and the ability to have that shutter held down forever in those tricky situations like trying to capture this pika barking that I did. A video's coming up very soon on that too. Got so many videos in the pipe coming at you here. It's very, very hard to get that pika barking. The reason is you will hear the bark, but you won't see the bark, because this guy it's actually a rabbit, which is kind of weird. It's not a mouse. It's only about that big, about the size of a hamster. And when it hits its head up and it barks, you don't see it. You just hear it and you see the head move barely. But if you're shooting fast enough, you can hold that shutter down and you don't know when it's going to happen. You'll just sit there and it'll just bark out of nowhere. You can really hit that shutter and just keep on it and keep on the pika the whole time and actually capture that bark, which is incredible. So look for that video also coming out. And it's got amazing colors and detail from the sensor and stills and video. So this is really, it's just a great wildlife and bird photographer shooter camera. The autofocus system is excellent. And yes, it's good once you put enough time behind this camera to understand it and how to use it. And yes, all the autofocus from time to time are going to search or hit the background no matter what brand you're shooting. But the more time you get behind this camera, because when I first had it, the autofocus drove me nuts because I was so used to the Canon autofocus system. But once I learned how to use this autofocus system, I'm really, really happy with it. Really happy with it. So, you know, really, what's not to love about this camera? Good job, Nikon. You're really making it hard for me the longer Canon goes to get that R1 out or the R5 Mark II out. It's making it really hard to make that decision not to just jump to Nikon. And John has that 400-2.8 with the teleconverter built into it. Oh, and he uses it so much, and I see it all the time, and so envious of that lens to have that teleconverter built in. And if I ever come on this channel and I'm reviewing that lens and I say I bought it, well, you'll know I've switched over to Nikon because that lens is $14,000. Ouch. But, oh, such a dream lens to have, because you're at 400-2.8, and if you flip that teleconverter, you're at 560 at f4. Just fantastic. Anyway, folks, thanks for watching this video. Like, subscribe, become a member of the channel for as low as $1 to help us bring more of this content for you. And as always, guys, until next time, get outside and go run that shutter.